Hey there and welcome back to another Dragon Prince video. And today we're going to be talking about two of the big players going forward into Season 4 of Dragon Prince. And of course, if you've read the title of the video, you'll know these characters are Callum, the main protagonist of the series, or at least one of the three main protagonists. But honestly, I do feel like he's presented as the top of the pyramid. And then of course, the other is the mysterious main antagonist, Aaravos, who's set to take up a much larger role than he's previously had in these first couple of seasons. Now, I've talked in depth about a lot of what I expect these characters are going to go through in the future of their story arcs. With Callum, it does seem very likely that the majority of his initial storyline is going to revolve around both trying to find Rayla, as she ghosted him off screen and he's still deeply salty about that years later, and of course he's probably also going to be hunting down Viren, because, eventually they are going to find out that that dude's somehow still kicking, and will obviously go after him to ensure that he doesn't keep getting up to any more nasty shenanigans. I doubt they're just going to let bygones be bygones. Especially since Rayla left on a quest to try and find Viren because she didn't think he was dead and she never returned. So that's really double the motivation. But anyway, there's still that whole other half of the equation, Aaravos, and what he's going to be up to. Which is probably not much at first if I'm being honest, as he's still stuck in his little pocket dimension prison. But what we do know is that he's been manipulating Claudia into bringing Viren back to life so that the two of them will help whatever's going to come out of the bug's cocoon help to free Aaravos from his prison, and in exchange he's going to restore Viren to life permanently. And ignoring the fact that this smells like an obvious betrayal storyline where Aaravos is going to bamboozle everybody and pull the good old-fashioned double cross, leaving Viren to die again and Claudia heartbroken, he will eventually need to move on to the next phase of his story. And so far in his appearances, he's been made out to be the Grand Manipulator, a schemer of the highest caliber who uses people for his own ends whilst making it seem like he's just an advisor, just a helper. And that's what he does to Viren for basically the entire duration of their friendship. He offers to help him. He's only looking to aid him. And all the while, he's moving the chess pieces around, preparing for his own return to the stage. We then see it again when he spends the next couple of years continuing to prepare his little grub creature, whilst also teaching Claudia what she needs to know to bring Viren back to life on a limited basis. And so now, once again, the pieces are in place for his return. He just needs his lackeys to get a wriggle on now. And so really, that's probably a big part of the first book of this new saga. Him chilling in his mirror dimension, just waiting for the others to kickstart his prison break. But what then? What happens after that? Who does he interact with? How do his relationships with our heroes play out, and specifically, Callum? After all, as a burgeoning master wizard who's able to use legit normal magic as opposed to only using dark magic like other human wizards, Callum's probably the only character with the skill set to take him down. He's the only character who can probably end up matching him as a legitimate threat, a proper contender. So it feels like that they are going to be the big rivalry that the show presents us with during the Mysteries of Aaravos saga. They're what's going to be that final confrontation. But how does that play out? How do we get there in the end? After all, the ending, that is a big part of things, but I think we all know how it ends. Aaravos dies, and Callum stands triumphant. This just doesn't seem like the type of show that's going to diverge from that sort of ending too hard. So I think the most important element of the story, therefore, is how we get there. The journey that the characters take, and most importantly, the interplay between the heroes and the villains, and of course, specifically Callum and Aaravos. And honestly, it is kind of hard to predict what sort of direction they're going to be taking the characters in their dynamic. But if I really try to narrow it down, I think there are three pathways that feel the most organic or realistic. And these pathways I've decided to name after Star Wars villains. And pretty much they all play the role that those villains do within their respective films or TV shows. And the first of these pathways, and probably the most boring of the three, is what I call the General Grievous pathway, or the Grand Moff Tarkin pathway for those that prefer the original trilogy. This pathway simply presents Aaravos as a villain that needs to be overcome by the heroes, specifically Callum. In Revenge of the Sith, General Grievous doesn't have any real depth. He's a generic evil guy that the heroes have to battle against, and that's really it. Even in the animated shows, he doesn't really have an arc beyond that. He's an evil henchman. And then, after his master dies, he becomes an evil villain, not just a henchman anymore. And this is a definite potential pathway for Aaravos' story to take. After all, we've seen it before. Firelord Ozai from Avatar springs to mind, a character who's simply there to be a villain completely and utterly. There's no real depth to their character beyond that villainy, which is okay for Avatar because there are other villains that took alternate pathways that made the show feel diverse and interesting in terms of its arcs. But for a show like this, where there are minimal villains and Aaravos is clearly being positioned as the major one, I think it would be a major mistake and would make him feel deeply one-dimensional. You build up this character, you have him be all mysterious, manipulating events from the shadows, and then when your heroes finally face off with him, he becomes a generic mustache twirler. And don't get me wrong, I do enjoy that sort of villain from time to time, but for this particular scenario, it just wouldn't work. His whole character's revolved around being a manipulator, and so I really think they need to lean into that, especially when it comes to his interactions with Team Zim, and especially with Callum. Which brings me to what I would assume are the most likely paths for him to follow through with, the Darth Vader path or the Palpatine path. And so let me explain them both. And we'll start with the Darth Vader pathway. Now, whilst the Darth Vader path might imply that Aaravos is going to get a redemption arc, because after all, Darth Vader gets one in Return of the Jedi, this isn't what I have in mind for this. Instead, this pathway more refers to a way to connect the two characters together, connect Callum and Aaravos. Because there are a number of unanswered questions about Callum. Who's his dad? Does he have any relevance to the backstory? And why is Callum seemingly the only human able to use regular magic without any sort of assistance, when it was previously thought to be impossible for a regular human to do this? And on top of that, he's able to do it at such a young age. Does he actually have an impressive secret lineage that we're going to be made aware of? Or do these questions not really matter at all? But for the Darth Vader path, we have to assume that these answers do matter. And that over the course of the story, Aaravos is eventually going to reveal something special to Callum that explains these loose plot threads. Maybe they do go for the ridiculous Hail Mary and just go, I am your father. Maybe he simply tells him that he has an impressive lineage. Maybe it harkens back all the way to that original wizard who blinded the old Dragon King. But either way, by revealing this, the idea would be that Aaravos wants to lure him to his side to become his new apprentice to help him take over the world, just like Darth Vader offers Luke at the end of Empire Strikes Back, after he reveals the truth of his parentage. But honestly, for me, this is not one that I really enjoy all that much. Mostly because I think the answers to these questions, they don't really need to matter. I think I like the idea that Callum is just some dude. Unlike his brother, he doesn't have that noble lineage. He's not royal, not truly. He isn't some divine dragon god like Zim or from a race of mystic elves. His entire backstory is that his mum was a badass, and now he is also a badass, but in a different way. I don't think everybody needs a secret twist backstory, and sometimes it's better to go with having the everyman character. After all, they're usually more relatable. And honestly, they've become rarer and rarer in popular media these days, where it feels like everybody's a secret king or a magical prophesized hero. And so, I think this is also not the path they're going to walk. I do think it makes sense for the story to have Aaravos try to turn Callum, because why wouldn't he? Dude's going to be a powerful wizard. I'd want that on my side if I was an up-and-coming Dark Lord. Plus, there's that whole teaser trailer for the title of the saga. It presents Aaravos as a puppet master, a chess master, and all these characters are his pieces. Makes sense to try and turn Callum into one of his pieces instead of one for the other side. Which of course brings us to our third and final pathway for the Aaravos-Callum relationship, and that is the Palpatine Path. Which is, pretty much as it implies if you know Star Wars, where Aaravos tries to manipulate Callum into either outright joining his side, or the more realistic prospect of forcing his hand into doing things that ultimately only benefit Aaravos. Actions that Callum probably would view as the right thing at the time, but that in hindsight only work out in favour of the opposing side. To me, this feels like the more realistic prospect, if I'm being honest, of all three pathways. And it feels the most in character for Aaravos, in that the majority of what we've seen from him has been manipulation, whispered words to Viren, now to Claudia too. It makes the most sense for him to try this on Callum when they first meet, and then a number of times afterwards, to try and turn him against his allies. Maybe try to turn him against the other elves perhaps. Pit the two sides against each other, try and position himself on top of the dog pile. Hell, maybe even play into his insecurities to try and get inside his head. His love for his brother, for Rayla. Maybe even his desire to try and learn various different types of magic. Maybe it would be interesting to have him secretly train him away from the group. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Callum's never even seen this guy before, right? I don't think they've interacted. So if he does get free, maybe he tries to ingratiate himself with the group, or just finds Callum when he's alone and gives him tips and tricks and advice. And I think that would be a really interesting way to get the audience invested in their relationship to the point that they want to see these two guys clash, to fight. And then also, it just injects some delicious angst for when Callum gets inevitably betrayed by Aaravos. Delicious. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the video. Whilst there are a number of ways they could handle the build-up of the Aaravos-Callum storyline, I think the third option that I've presented is going to prove the most satisfying in the end. Let him try to manipulate him, to befriend him, and then crumble it down with some delicious angst. to really up the emotional stakes of the fight. But of course, as always, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of my points? Agree? Disagree? Do you have anything to add? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.